Shining, the paranormal faculty which is at the core of both the book and the film, has two key aspects to it. Firstly, the ability to see both future and past events, and secondly, the ability to communicate telepathically with other similarly gifted individuals. The aim of this video is to suggest how Kubrick may have incorporated references to the future and to the past into the fabric of his film. The theory that we'll use to test this is that as a highly respected filmmaker, he was able to exert subtle, easily overlooked influences on the future films and television programs which his key cast members appeared in, while exploiting past roles of theirs in the movie too. This presentation will focus purely on Jack Nicholson and Shelley Duvall. The basis for the theory was shown in the first video in this series on The Shining. In it, Jack Nicholson's future role in Warren Beatty's Reds was highlighted. He knew at the time of filming The Shining that he would be playing Eugene O'Neill in that film. Kubrick must have known it too. That Stephen King likened Jack Torrance to O'Neill in his novel only adds to the plausibility of this coupling. Nicholson appears to have made a nod back to The Shining in Reds. He subtly inverts a paper he's writing on so it can't be read, in a similar gesture to one he made in the Colorado lounge when Wendy was entering. Now, this notion of inversion is something I need to be clear about before we get into testing the theory out. It was this word I used to describe Nicholson's action with paper, but it's a concept central to The Shining both as a novel and a film. The obvious example is red rum, which is of course the inverse of murder. It originates in the novel, and it's important in the film too. It's been suggested ever since The Shining was released that the scene of the young woman arising from behind the shower curtain was an inversion of the shower scene from Psycho, i.e., in The Shining, the threat comes from within the shower, whereas in Psycho, it came from outside the shower. Another example is that the old lady rising from the bath inverted a scene with the younger man in Clouseau's Les Diaboliques. Now, these are not original finds, but in the course of the presentation, hopefully you're going to see some which are. The title page of this presentation alludes to a short story written by Stephen Crane, and how this supports what I will conjecture. For those who don't know about this important clue to The Shining, here is a short introduction. In Kubrick's interview with Michel Simon, the director says, The Shining uses a similar kind of psychological misdirection to the Stephen Crane story The Blue Hotel. This is the last story in the collection depicted on the right here. In this, the main character foresees his own death in a card game he is playing. However, the game he is actually killed in happens in the near future, but in a different location to the game where he had the premonition. I'll disclose why this supports my conjecture at the end of the second part of this presentation. So now let's start to test the theory. I've already suggested how Reds hints back to The Shining, but in making The Shining, Nicholson makes explicit reference to working with Boris Karloff, and one of the films he made with him was The Terror. Might that have influenced The Shining? In The Terror, Jack Nicholson played André Duvalier, a Napoleonic soldier lost after the Battle of Jena Auerstadt in October 1806. Towards the end of the film, he rescues a cursed woman from a flooding cellar, actually played by his future wife Sandra Knight. Upon kissing her, she starts to decompose. The parallel to the bathroom scene in room 237 is obvious. The coincidence of his character name to Shelley Duvall's is noteworthy too. So there appears to be strong evidence that The Terror informed The Shining too. So what about other past films of his? In 1970, Jack Nicholson had a small role in Vincenzo Minnelli's On a Clear Day You Can See Forever, playing Barbra Streisand's ex-stepbrother who confesses to being in love with her. Streisand herself plays Daisy Gamble, who is capable of telepathic communication. While under hypnosis, she recalls other lives she has experienced. One was a past life as a psychic in historic England, innocently convicted of treason for crimes involved with the loss of shipping. This bears an uncanny resemblance to the background story of an article in the Scrapbook concerning Helen Duncan, the last woman in Britain to be convicted of witchcraft. Another life Daisy saw was in the future. In other words, by seeing the past and the future and being able to communicate telepathically, Daisy Gamble could shine. So The Shining wasn't the first film Nicholson had been in about such psychic powers. Furthermore, the famous song which concludes the film finishes with the words, "On a clear day you can see forever and ever and ever," which reinforces the words the twins use, which originated in King's novel. So, like The Terror, a very evident parallel to The Shining can be drawn from On a Clear Day You Can See Forever. Another couple of classic Nicholson roles might provide more tenuous connections. The first of these was as Jake Gittis in Polanski's classic Chinatown. As Gittis starts his investigation, he pretends to photograph his partner. The phrase he uses strikes a chord with that used in the interview in The Shining, especially as far as the intonation is concerned. Now, I do understand that in isolation that phrase does seem very tenuous. Chinatown does have other things to offer, but I'm afraid that this is not the point to raise them. Antonionis the passenger also appears to provide support for my theory about character change. This is actually a film about adopting a new identity. But just before filming with Kubrick, Nicholson finished directing Going South, in which he also played the intriguingly named Henry Lloyd Moon. Now, does this film have anything to offer? In an early scene, Henry Moon is sentenced to death unless a woman offers to marry him. An elderly lady does, but as he goes to embrace her, she collapses and dies. Fortunately, an attractive young woman agrees to take her place. Now, this clearly inverts the bathroom sequence in The Shining. Furthermore, Going South begins with a homage to the entrance of Omar Sharif in Lawrence of Arabia. Nicholson inverts this legendary scene for the opening to his film. Henry Moon is seen to be mounting his horse and riding into the distance. It made me wonder what the opening to The Shining would be like if Kubrick had emulated his leading man-cum-director and used inversion to open his film. Now, hopefully you'll agree with these descriptive features of the opening scene. Firstly, it's a highly dynamic shot. A helicopter was used. Secondly, it's got magic hour lighting. It was filmed at about 6 o'clock in the morning. Thirdly, there's a stunning landscape depicting a range of mountains surrounding a beautiful expanse of mirror-like water. And lastly, there's a car on the right, moving away from the viewer across the screen. Now let's describe a theoretical inversion to that. Replacing the highly dynamic helicopter shot, we have a static camera with very minimal movement. The magic hour lighting disappears to be replaced by twilight or very poor light. The stunning landscape of those mountains becomes a bland landscape, with a mountain to show the presence of mountains and a patch of water to show the presence of water. And instead of the car on the right moving away from the viewer, we see a car on the left moving towards the viewer. Now, as images, might that description look a little like this? If you don't recognise these shots, they're from the opening of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Milos Forman's 1975 classic, which starred both Jack Nicholson and Scatman Crothers, both of whom, of course, are in The Shining. The mountain in the background is Mount Bachelor in the Cascades mountain range in Oregon. It's in the same mountain range as Mount Hood, where the Timberline Lodge, which doubled as the Overlook Hotel, is located. So we could argue that Going South partially influenced the bathroom scene, and also an inverted reference to One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Now let's look at Shelley Duvall. Prior to The Shining, Shelley Duvall's career had largely been associated with one director, Robert Altman. One of the early films she did with him was McCabe and Mrs. Miller. Now, at the risk of sounding repetitive, it was McCabe's demise at the end of McCabe and Mrs. Miller which inspired the shot of Jack Torrance as the Iceman at the end of The Shining. So we've already established a clear reference from that film to The Shining. However, a far more significant influence on The Shining came from her role as Millie Lamoureux in Altman's Three Women. Altman is on record as saying that Three Women was inspired by a dream. Star Shelley Duvall as Millie Lamoureux, Sissy Spacek as Pinky, but whose real name is Mildred, and Janice Rule as Willie. The similarity of the three names implies a connection between the women, possibly as different personalities of a woman, either at different phases of life, or as Shelley Duvall has said, representing the id, ego and superego of Freudian psychology. Although by no means directly analogous to Frankenheimer's Seconds, it is nonetheless a film about character change and multiple personalities. Lamoureux pretends to be a social magnet, but appears to be ignored or rejected by many other people in the film. It would be easy to see how she could represent a wife whom her husband might want to kill, as Kubrick claimed he wanted in the role of Wendy Torrance. But the parallels with The Shining don't stop there. For a start, both films have mazes in them, and also both films have twins. Millie's Lounge and Wendy's Lounge both have similar chair arrangements, sofa against the wall and a separate armchair with a lamp table at the corner. They even light their cigarettes in a similar way, with a slightly trembling hand. Now you're probably just thinking to yourself that the chair layout is far from uncommon, and that the way she lights a cigarette is just an idiosyncrasy of Shelley Duvall's acting technique. That would be entirely possible. But when Kubrick has also obviously imported idiosyncratic elements of her character in Three Women, such as Millie and Wendy's similarly favourite colours, there surely has to be a deeper reason. Interestingly though, Millie's favourite colours even influence her address. She lives at the Purple Sage Apartments, 396 Colgate Road, Desert Centre. Why I mention this will become apparent in later presentations. It's almost as if Millie Lamoureux has been jokingly transplanted from Three Women into The Shining, and has become a second character for Shelley Duvall to play, in the same way as Eugene O'Neill was for Jack Nicholson. So was Kubrick doing this to pay a subtle homage to Robert Altman's film? If so, why would Kubrick, who prided himself on bettering others, want to limit himself to 2 characters per actor? Perhaps we should be prepared to meet other individuals in their character mix sometime soon. But before leaving Three Women, let's briefly look at 3 more scene comparisons. Firstly, the childlike Pinky and the child Danny looking into bathroom mirrors. Then Millie and Wendy, each holding their preferred brands of milk, both in red and white cartons. And finally, an intriguing posture shown by Millie and then emulated by the old lady in the bathroom of room 237. But Altman wasn't the only director Duvall had worked with. Just before The Shining, she had appeared in one of Kubrick's favourite films, Woody Allen's Annie Hall. One standout commonality is that both films contain The Catcher in the Rye. Kubrick fans will also spot that in Annie Hall, Shelley Duvall uses the word Kafkaesque, which conjures up a response Kubrick made in an interview with Michel Simon about the realism of The Overlook. Kubrick stated, "It seemed to me that the perfect guide for this approach could be found in Kafka's writing style." Also of interest is that other than The Shining, Annie Hall is the only film where Shelley Duvall and Jack Nicholson appear together, albeit Nicholson is a verbal reference made by the character Tony Lacey. Lacey was portrayed by singer Paul Simon, who Shelley Duvall was in a relationship with at the time. It was him she spoke of in making The Shining when she discussed a relationship coming to an end. So The Catcher in the Rye, a subject of a forthcoming video, is common to both of those films. Annie Hall is, however, very significant to The Shining. We'll be seeing it again in later presentations. So, we've looked at Shelley Duvall's past. Now what about her future? Immediately after working on The Shining, Duvall went back to play a leading role in her original mentor's new film, Robert Altman's Popeye, in which she starred as Olive Oyl. She considered her experience working with Kubrick to be grueling, so it would seem unlikely that she herself would make a backward gesture, as Nicholson appeared to do in Reds. Nonetheless, Popeye does contain a reference to Kubrick. The name of the hotel in Sweet Haven, the setting for Popeye, was the Seafarers Hotel. The Seafarers was the name of a 1953 documentary directed by Stanley Kubrick. And so there we have it. Both Nicholson's and Duvall's past and future films have references to Kubrick, if not The Shining itself. Now you might consider them trivial and tenuous, but bear in mind that those qualities also make them easily overlooked. And given the conjecture speculated in the last video that there might be a light-hearted side to The Shining, that pun is very much intended. The big question now is if it works for Shelley Duvall and for Jack Nicholson, whether a similar pattern can be found for other collaborators in The Shining. That aspect, together with the conundrum of the Blue Hotel, will be covered in The Shining Part 2. So thank you for viewing this presentation. I hope the content was of interest, even if the production values left something to be desired. I'm afraid I'm not too gifted in that area. Also, please remember that this is just one small facet of the puzzle that is The Shining. To learn more, you'll need to follow the breadcrumbs, as it were, and view further presentations. So if you're interested in doing that, please remember to like, subscribe and share this one. Thank you.